Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Royal Society of Medicine. This event, which is live, is part of our In Conversation series. I'm Susie Walton, I'm the Vice President of the RSM. We started these events in 2019, and we've been honoured to have hosted key thinkers, leaders in different fields, and many others. Mostly, we've actually been able to run these events from 1 Wimpole Street, which is our London HQ, but now we are in different times. COVID-19 has changed life for everyone. At the RSM, we are doing all we can to stay in touch and stay connected with our members and with the public. And so our In Conversation series continues via technology, and you can, in fact, to prove it's live, you can submit questions using the Q&A button, which you should see. It is my absolute pleasure today to introduce Sir John Scarlett. Sir John is the former Chief of the British Secret Intelligence Service, otherwise known as MI6. He's also chaired Government's Joint Intelligence Committee, otherwise known as JIC, and he's been the chair of Bletchley Park. He's fluent in French and Russian. He received his degree from Oxford, where he read history. During his government career, he served, among other places, in Moscow, Nairobi, and Paris. John, welcome to the RSM.
Thank you very much, Susie. Pleased to be here.
Fantastic. John, we are in absolutely unprecedented times, and you yourself are no stranger to extreme circumstances. In fact, I believe you took up the post with JIC just about 1 week, I think, before the September 11 attacks in America. So can you draw on your experience, and can you tell us how you think that people can cope with something as unexpected and as unpredictable as COVID-19?
Indeed. I mean, I started as chairman of the JRC on a Monday, and a Tuesday of the following week was 9/11. And, well, I think it's important to say that, what we have now and the situation we're facing now, we need to be very careful about drawing comparisons with events in the past or even the recent past. There is nothing quite comparable to the various aspects of what we're dealing with now. I mean, there have been a lot of comparisons made to, understandably, to various wartime situations and so on. And of course, I think, oh, well, the First World War broke out very, very suddenly and quickly and was absolutely, massive in its impact. But even that, obviously, in crucial ways, is completely different from what we've got now. So we've got to be careful about too easy comparisons or trying to draw lessons which may not actually be applicable. And the nearest I personally have come to something, well, I don't know what to say, but which might be talked about, is indeed 9/11. And I say that particularly because of the sheer scale of the event, the completely unexpected nature of it, and then the impact it had for a long time afterwards, in all sorts of areas, of course, of activity and on society generally. I think I might also mention 7/7, 7th of July 2005, because that was a direct attack here in the UK and was targeting us. And those attacks were targeting us. And so therefore, of course, I remember it intently as I was in charge of the service at that time. And I remember all the emotions I had. I mean, maybe one other anecdote I might just say regarding 9/11. I mean, one of my sort of memories, everybody remembers what they were doing that day, and I obviously do. And in between the two attacks by the aircraft into the World Trade Center, after the first one, I picked up the phone immediately in an old-fashioned way to talk to the cabinet secretary. And whilst I was waiting on the phone for him to come, I saw on the TV screen the second attack go in. And at that very moment, I absolutely, definitely remember thinking, well, it's a good thing that I've spent 30 years in the intelligence service, so I'm used to stress, because I'm going to have a lot of stress. And then the second thing I felt, my life is probably never going to be the same again. And that was certainly true.
So let's stick with that. Let's stick with that theme of stress. Because obviously right now people are working in extreme situations that go far beyond what they were trained for. I'm thinking in particular of medical staff in intensive care units, the nurses, the doctors, the cleaners. In your experience, how do people keep motivated and keep mentally healthy when they are under such severe stress?
Well, of course, the example you're giving and the medical staff, and I'm very well aware of this, is not the same as the people who work with me in the circumstances I've just described, but there's a certain parallel. And my memory, absolutely, is that immediately everybody, got sort of stuck in. There was a strong belief that what they were doing was really important, would make a difference, and was a fundamental contribution to society, in that case, the security of our society and of our way of life. People working very hard, not thinking about when they started the day or when they ended the day, very much working closely with colleagues. And of course, that sometimes is possible, clearly in medical health circumstances, but for many people, it's rather difficult at the moment to work with colleagues. And so, we have all those issues. But certainly my experience was working with colleagues, strong belief in what you're doing, very much encouraged by being part of a team and having hopefully, a good leader of that particular team. And it was a combined teamwork affair.
Fascinating. And thank you for those insights, John. Let's go right back to you at the very beginning of your career. I believe you actually had 38 years in intelligence. And I'd like to build up a picture of you as a young man and entering MI6. Was it by default or by design? How did you get into the intelligence world?
Okay, well, fine. That's a good question, of course, understandable. The first thing to say is that when I joined, I should admit it was in 1971, and I always like to say that I was a very, very young officer when I joined. But of course, in 1971, circumstances were very different. The service did not exist officially at all. And although there were lots of books and so on written about it, there was a general lack of understanding, which everybody acknowledged, about the service. It wasn't supposed to be known about. And as a very young man, just straight, or more or less almost straight out of university, I really knew virtually nothing. I mean, virtually nothing, not quite nothing. So therefore, obviously I didn't apply. You couldn't apply. There was no website, obviously then, no applications, no adverts in the underground or anything like that. Probably if I had tried to apply, I'd have been seen as a security risk. It was complete by chance. I had applied, or I did apply for an analyst job in the Foreign Office, and I left my address and so on, in fact, my mother's address at the time. And several months later, a letter appeared, because it was letters in those days, inviting me for an interview with an organization that I'd never heard of in Carlton Gardens. And so I went to that interview, and then the process began. And one other thing I remember from it, I went through nearly an hour's interview, and a very nice guy who was interviewing me, but it wasn't clear exactly what it was that I was being interviewed for. So eventually I did ask the question, well, what is this organization? What exactly does it do? And the answer I was given was, it's an organization which provides support.
So there you were as a young man in a job that you didn't, there was no strategy that got you there. It sort of happened. And then you realized what the organization was, but there must have been an amazing feeling of not really knowing quite what world you'd ended up in. So can you tell us something about the people or incidents early on in your career that had a big impact on you?
Well, of course, almost everything had an influence from the very beginning when you join something at that stage. And certainly, back then, when I was, let's say, 23, if anybody had said to me that I'd still be there 38 years later, or nearly 38 years later, I'd have been very surprised. You don't look that far ahead when you're that age, by and large. It was obviously a very interesting job, with a very interesting organisation, and that's what I wanted. I wanted something really interesting and demanding. And what happened in 5 or 6 years' time? Well, who knows? You know, you just went on. But I have to say that from the very beginning, I just was completely absorbed in what I was doing. I really never thought or was tempted to look elsewhere. I sometimes say to people now, and I certainly said when I was in charge, that I didn't regard it as a job, or I never thought I was going out in the morning to go to work. That was just, you know, life, and it was just part of what you did. And I can't think of a single day when I didn't want to go and carry on with my work. I think that is an honest statement.
Did you have any role models? Anybody you inspired?
Yes, you asked about that. What was influential? Well, of course, obviously, many of my, and I have very clear memories of my early bosses and superiors and colleagues, and mainly, almost entirely in those days, men, I have to say. It would be very different now, I'm glad to say. And, you know, I learned a lot at that stage from bosses and from colleagues, but quite early in my career, I was very influenced by one particular operation, which was an exceptional operation that I was aware of. I won't say any more than that. And this concerned an absolutely major operation, which was being run by the service and is now known about within the KGB in London, with Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky. And I learned so much from being aware of that case and of that individual. The integrity that was shown, the intellect that was shown, the commitment that was shown, the sheer bravery that was shown, and how valuable that work was. And, you know, once I'd seen that in practice, then somehow there was a standard there that one tried to sort of meet, whatever you were doing afterwards.
Did you have any moments early on when you wished you hadn't signed on the dotted line?
No.
To go off
No.
and do something else?
No, I did not.
Is it true? And by all means, don't answer the questions I'm asking. Is it true you were expelled from Russia?
Well, no, it's not quite true, actually. I was in 1994, April 1994, I had been in Moscow for 2.5 years as the services representative. It was after, of course, the end of the Soviet Union, and indeed I was the first official representative of the service since, I think, well, since the revolution. It was, to put it mildly, an extremely interesting and quite stressful position, but extremely stimulating. You know, I did, I think, good and constructive work there, certainly with lots of help, including with Russian colleagues. But I was asked to leave, or I left at their request. It was quite polite, because an application for a very senior Russian intelligence officer to come to London to be my equivalent in London, his visa application was refused. And so, probably unsurprisingly, it was felt awkward having me in Moscow. And so I left. They were gentle and kind about it, actually, at the time. My wife and my son, who was at school in Moscow, they were allowed to stay until the end of the term. Then when I went to the airport to meet them 2 or 3 weeks later, after I come back myself, I found the media there. And awkwardly, I was wearing a strange hat, which I'm afraid was then caught on in the photos. Then it was quite a big story for a couple of days. And then, of course, it became known, you know, what I was doing. And so that happened in 1994.
But to some degree, throughout your career, as with anybody in the security world, you were working in covert situations, and you were not, your day-to-day, the operations you were involved in were not widely known. So you went from being somebody in a covert world who wasn't widely known to heading up the service, to being the head of MI6, and I believe you held that post from 2004 to 2009. So how did your career progress such that you ended up leading the service?
Well, of course, that's a good question, and probably lots of people, for different chiefs over the years ask that question. I don't really know exactly. All I can say is if I look back to see what advantages I had, first of all, as has been discussed, I joined when I was young, and so I had that extra chance. I did some very interesting postings, starting off in East Africa, sort of in the post-colonial period. And then I was serving in Moscow in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was definitely still there and nobody was thinking it was going to disappear. And so I experienced the Soviet Union, which I still find quite a useful thing to have done. I had quite a lot of experience with very interesting casework. And then I spent 4 years in Paris, working very closely with French colleagues. And I think it's worth saying here that I learned how very, very good their services were. It was very stimulating and educational to work with them. I then had experience with working from London, with South Africa, also in the Balkans in the 1990s. And of course, between October 91 and April 94, I was working, as I've just said, in Russia, or the Soviet Union, and then Russia. And we were actually there on the day, of course, when the Soviet Union came to an end. And so I experienced that. And it's worth saying in this context, in this conversation, if we're talking about living through extreme and stressful situations, although I was an observer to that situation, there were quite a few people in Moscow at the time who thought that MI6 were actually responsible for it. So I had to go around explaining to people that actually wasn't true. But I was an observer of it. But I saw the immense pressure and stress and the many personal emotions and even tragedies which were experienced by people in Russia at that time.
So what are you doing? So you held that post from 2004 to 2009. So what are you doing now? I guess you can't tell us if you're still in the intelligence world, but I know that you travel a lot and you lecture a lot. So would you like to tell us a little bit about John Scarlett today?
I've left government service, I really have. That was 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, which is a bit awkward to say. I now have a number of roles which I'm very committed to. I'm an international affairs advisor in the corporate world, and I give international affairs advice to a number of corporates. That means, of course, that I can't just live on my past knowledge. I have to sort of have a fairly good idea of what's going on at the moment. So I work at that. I am a director of my own company, advisory company, which I run with an old friend and colleague of mine. And I do quite a lot of work in the think tank world. Particularly I'm vice chairman at RUSI here in London, and I have a role with the advisory council in the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And I find that think tank work extremely stimulating and of course very helpful. And then I have been involved with different charities. I was, but I'm no longer trustee of the Imperial War Museum. And as you mentioned, I was chair of the Bletchley Park Trust for several years until just over a year ago, which was a wonderful role.
We've spoken a lot about your career in the intelligence services and the work you've done since leaving government. We have a question from one of our audience members here. Do you have any hobbies?
Well, my two things maybe on that. One is that I'm very, very fortunate to have a wonderful and large family, and a great deal of time is taken up, but probably not as much as it should be, with that hobby, supporting, being active with my very fine family. Very firmly together with my wife. I know that in answer to the question in Who's Who, that one has to say, what are your hobbies and interests? Originally, several years ago, when I first went into that, I made probably the mistake of saying that I was interested in medieval architecture. I'm not sure whether it still says that. And I suppose that's a sort of hobby. Although I have to say that in the village where I am at the moment, given that we're on lockdown, and I go up to our nearby church. We have lots of medieval churches around here. On the notice board, there is on the door there is a notice which says, "This church is closed for the first time in 1,000 years." And you just it's there, but it's something that makes you think about what's going on now for the first time in 1,000 years.
Let's move on to horizon scanning. Now, you served in central government under the Blair administration, and as did I. I ran a programme of work in the Cabinet Office called Strategic Futures. We horizon scanned for future threats to government and indeed to UK PLC. So looking at horizon scanning, what I'd like to know, and what I think our audience would like to know from you, is how does one, indeed can one, predict situations like COVID-19? And if governments or countries or think tanks or individuals can predict situations like that, then to what degree can you actually build resilience to manage situations like that?
Well, it's a very good question, of course. I think one needs to take it in stages somehow. The first stage is to be, obviously, as you look around the world the whole time in a holistic way, in a sort of global way, and you watch it change, being there, understanding the big strategic changes which are taking place, and maybe the consequences and risks that they carry. So that's your sort of starting point. You need to have an overarching and well-founded concept of where the big risks, if you like, and unpredictabilities are in the world at any one time. And at the moment, obviously, that will very much have to take account of the scale and the speed of change, which is going on in the world and has been going on for quite a few years. But much of that, of course, is linked to technology and the whole process of globalization, and rapid change inevitably brings uncertainty with it. And then, of course, that brings in quite quickly, and you can show this in things that have been written and studied in the past, the recent past, issues of global pandemics, for example, or indeed climate change. These are issues which are there as overarching concepts. And indeed, I would say that in 2010, so 20 years ago, in the National Security Strategy, which was written at that time, and divided up the risks that the country was facing into different tiers. One of the risks in tier 1, and I double checked this because it was my memory, but I double checked it. One of the risks in tier 1 was of a global influenza pandemic, which might, that was the phraseology used, influenza pandemic, which might affect us in some way or another, and it had that mention. So once you've done that, and you've identified, let's say, that particular threat, a potential threat, then it gets you to a starting point where you can begin to think about how you prepare for it, if it comes through in some way. So that's how you start to build resilience. And again, if you're acting correctly and you're following up the logic of your conclusions and your advice, you say, right, okay, well, we need to be alert to that. And then you have to start thinking more precisely about, well, okay, if we're worried about a pandemic, in what circumstances might it start? Where might it start? And what society or what kinds of societies are particularly vulnerable to it? And how do we spot it, as early as possible when the process begins? So it's a combination of overarching foresight and analysis, if you like, the initial preparation and effective preparation to enable resilience, and then it's a question of information gathering, intelligence gathering, if you like, just being, watching all the time and making sure that you've got the data coming in, and that can be coming in through your own efforts, or it can be coming in, and hopefully will be coming in through close international collaboration and cooperation.
Thank you. That's fascinating, John. Now, returning for a moment to the service, what would you say are the biggest challenges facing the UK's intelligence services right now?
It's a very challenging time. I always used to think that I was facing many challenges when I was in that job. When I look at it now, I see that they've all become much more complex and complicated. And the first thing I'd say is the sheer combination of really tough challenges which are there. So we have definite challenges presented to us by potentially challenging, I won't put it more strongly than that, state actors who are out there, and they are certainly no less challenging and active than they were 10 or 20 years ago. That's at the same time, we have, of course, the continuing terrorism threat, which has gone up and down, and it may not be quite like it was on 9/11 or 7/7, but it's very complicated and complex, as we've seen in the most recent period, and really much more difficult now to identify. And I'll just mention how a single truck driver acting probably more or less on his own in Nice in July 2016 managed to kill, I think, 84 people. And then of course we have all that's surrounded by technological change and technology. And technology is a huge, just all-embracing factor. You simply got to understand it and be at the very cutting edge of technology. It's one of the things I've learned from history and Bletchley Park, which was mentioned earlier on. We were at the cutting edge of technology and we won. And we have to remain at the cutting edge of technology, and actually we are very good at that, but it gets more and more complicated. And for an intelligence officer, remember, technology and cyber, it's so much of it's about information, about data, and that's intelligence. Vast quantities of it, far greater quantities and complexities than was the case when I started, or indeed was the case in the days of Bletchley Park.
Sorry about the grilling, John, but we're not letting you off the hook yet. What is the funniest, this is another audience question, the funniest anecdote from your career? Does anything immediately spring to mind as being particularly amusing? Or your wife clearly has.
Well, can I just? I'll try some advice there, Tom.
Yeah.
Go on. Oh yes, actually, yes. Well, there was an incident when I was in Russia back in the early 90s when I was with some colleagues. I won't say any more about them. And at the end of a very nice meal in the banya, in the sauna, they stood up and drank and asked us all to raise our glasses to the Queen. And so we all stood up and we raised our glasses to the Queen, and then I stood up and said we should raise our glasses to the President of the Russian Federation, and they refused to stand up.
Sir John, thank you very much for that. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your honesty and your wonderful insights. You've given us some really interesting perspectives based on an absolutely extraordinary career in intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, we've not charged you for tonight's webinar. Instead, and if you wish, we are inviting you to support the RSM in these unprecedented times so that we may support others. If you'd like to make a donation, please go to support us at our website, or indeed, if a link appears on your screen, please just follow that. The donations will directly fund the RSM's vision, which is to advance health through education and innovation. Thank you very much for your generosity, and thank you very much for sharing your time with us. And thank you very much to Sir John, and thank you to everybody for being part of RSM's In Conversation live series.
Thank you, Susie, and everyone who's here. Thank you.